Chapter 1. The first thing I did after being reborn was to break off my engagement with Luis. In my previous life, I dedicated most of my life to Luis. Even when I was gravely ill, he couldn't wait for me to die before secretly planning a grand silver-haired wedding with Roma. Their wedding coincided with my funeral. This time, I won't be so foolish. While Luis was busy rebelling against his family to protest the arranged marriage and serving Roma and her daughter, I visited his family home. Fiona, marrying into our family was your grandfather's dying wish. It's an arrangement our families agreed upon a long time ago. The grandfather of Luis brought out the yellowed marriage contract. I read it carefully from beginning to end, then shifted my gaze to the man standing behind him. If I must marry in 2 weeks, then I'll marry him, I said. The moment I announced my intention to marry Leo, the entire room fell silent. Grandfather was utterly stunned. Fiona, marriage is no joke. You and Luis were promised to each other before you were even born. You grew up together as childhood sweethearts. How can you suddenly decide not to marry him and instead choose Leo? He wasn't wrong. I had known since I was a child that I would grow up to be Luis's wife. 4 years. My greatest wish had been to marry him. But he never loved me. In my previous life, Luis reluctantly gave in to his family's arrangement and married me. His first words to me after our wedding were, "Fiona, since you insisted on marrying me, you'd better be prepared for the fact that I will never love you." Back then, I thought he was just speaking out of frustration. After all, love grows over time. I couldn't believe he had no feelings for me after all those years. Nor did I believe that he would remain so cold toward me even after we were married. But I was wrong. After we married, Roma moved to the south, becoming the lingering regret in his heart. Even in our 60s, Luis would often sit alone in his study, staring at the love letters he had once written to Roma, silently shedding tears. Before I died, he told me with a cold expression, "If I hadn't promised my grandfather never to divorce you, I would have married Roma long ago. You were the one who tore us apart." Only then did I realize he didn't just not love me, he resented me to the core. He despised me so much that he didn't hesitate to hold a grand wedding with Roma on the day of my funeral. This time, I will never let history repeat itself. Grandpa, I'm not joking. When our families arranged this marriage, they only said I had to marry into your family. Not that it specifically had to be Luis, right? Leo, grandfather's youngest son, was born when he was over 50 years old, making him only 5 years older than Luis. In my previous life, I remembered that after grandfather passed away, Leo left for another country and never married. My impression of him was limited to knowing he was a quiet and reserved man. Because he outranked Luis and me in seniority, he always carried himself like a mature adult. Even as a child, there were no rumors about him being engaged to anyone, nor any whispers of a secret lover he held dear. If I must marry, and if it's to someone who won't love me anyway, I might as well choose a husband with whom I can share mutual respect. That's far better than enduring a lifetime of resentment and bitterness. Seeing my unwavering resolve, grandfather sighed deeply. You're right, but we still need to see what Leo thinks. Leo stood tall as always, his white shirt perfectly pressed without a single crease. When I noticed him frown suddenly, my heart jumped into my throat. In my haste to escape Luis's trap, I had completely forgotten to consider Leo's opinion. He'll probably refuse me, right? To my surprise, in the next moment, Leo spoke. If you're certain about this, I have no objections. The grandfather's face lit up with a wide smile. Great! Then the wedding will proceed as planned in 2 weeks. Everything with the venue has already been arranged. I said I'm not marrying Fiona. Before grandfather could finish, Luis stormed in, slamming the door behind him in anger. He shot me a look of pure disdain before turning to his grandfather. Grandpa, it's the modern age. Arranged marriages are nothing but outdated feudal nonsense. If you don't let me marry Roma, I'll never come home again. Chapter 2. The sound of a radio drama playing in the background was drowned out by grandfather slamming the table in fury. How many times do I have to tell you? A woman like Roma, who's had a child out of wedlock, is not fit to marry into our family. You're running after her like a fool, and now my old comrades are laughing at me. Luis had already fallen head over heels for Roma and wouldn't tolerate anyone speaking ill of her, not even his grandfather. I don't care. The only woman I'll marry in this lifetime is Roma. If you won't allow it, I'll move into the staff dormitory and never come home again." Luis turned and stormed out, but not before glaring at me with hatred. "It's useless to run crying to Grandpa. I'll never marry you, so you'd better give up." It turned out Luis thought I had come here to pressure him into marriage. Little did he know that my greatest wish in this lifetime was to stay as far away from him as possible. "Don't chase after him," Grandfather barked at the housekeeper, taking a sip of tea to calm himself. "He's spoiled rotten by me. If he wants to sever ties with the family over some woman, so be it." Luis, true to his word, moved straight into the staff dormitory at school. I often saw him and Roma together in the school cafeteria. A colleague who was close to me voiced her indignation. "Fiona, it's bad enough that Luis got Roma a job as a substitute teacher here, but now that you two are about to get married, they're still inseparable. Anyone who didn't know better would think she's the one marrying Luis." I gave a faint smile and continued eating my meal. "It doesn't matter. I'm not marrying him anyway." "What?" I had spoken softly, and my colleague didn't catch what I said. I simply shook my head lightly and didn't say anything more. Before marrying Leo, I didn't want to stir up unnecessary trouble. As for Luis and Roma, they were no longer any of my concern. Since I wasn't marrying Luis, there was no reason for me to stay in the house Grandfather had prepared for us. Previously, out of kindness, Grandfather had insisted I move into the new house by myself, saying it was close to the school and in a safe neighborhood. But now, I have decided to move out. What I didn't expect was to find my personal belongings messily tossed into the hallway as soon as I arrived. "Fiona, you're back? I'm really sorry, but Luis asked me to move in with my daughter, and I had no place to put your things, so I had to leave them in the hallway for now." Roma stood at the doorway, arms crossed, wearing a floral dress that screened her claim as the lady of the house. "You know how chaotic it is in a tenement building. Luis didn't want us to suffer, so he asked you to move out for now. Sorry for the inconvenience. In my previous life, Luis had also brought Roma into our marital home and forced me out. Back then, I had been heartbroken and desperate, screaming at Luis, asking how he could let another woman sleep in our home. But he had sneered coldly and replied, "We're not even married yet. When has my house ever been your business?" This time, I felt nothing. Seeing me silently gather my belongings without responding, Roma grew impatient. "Aren't you jealous? Aren't you afraid that in the end, Luis will marry me instead of you?" I raised my head and gave her a cold look. "AB****** H and a dog, a match made in heaven." Roma, clearly unused to such sharp words, froze for a moment before her face turned red with anger. "Who are you calling AB****** H? Luis arrived at the commotion. Seeing Roma in tears, he immediately decided I was the one at fault. "Fiona, it's just a temporary move. Do you really have to be so aggressive? Or is it that you're only marrying me because you're after my family's money?" Luis was always like this, arrogant and self-absorbed, convinced he was always right. I didn't want to argue with them anymore and turned to leave. As I walked away, I heard Luis still rambling behind me. "Fiona, a woman like you can dream all you want, but you'll never marry me. I'm not showing up to the wedding in 2 weeks. Just wait to embarrass yourself." Chapter 3. I moved back to the staff dormitory to avoid any further contact with Luis and his mess. The school was buzzing with rumors about Luis and Roma, and almost everyone I passed gave me sympathetic looks. A week later, the principal suddenly summoned me to his office. He pointed to a letter on his desk, his expression serious. "MS. Fiona, someone has reported to the higher-ups that the essay you submitted for the teacher's writing competition was plagiarized. This is being taken very seriously." Faced with this sudden accusation, I was completely baffled. "Principal, I wrote every word of that essay myself. How could it be plagiarism? And who exactly am I supposed to have plagiarized?" The principal sighed, looking as though he was just as helpless as I was. "The accuser has provided drafts and outlines as evidence. Even if I wanted to suppress this, there's nothing I can do. Perhaps you should take a leave of absence for a few days?" It felt like an explosion went off in my head. As I stumbled out of the principal's office in a daze, I saw Roma waiting by the door. At that moment, Everything became clear. Most of my belongings had been left in the house that was supposed to be our marital home. Apart from Roma, I couldn't think of anyone else who would have taken my drafts to accuse me of plagiarism. Was it you? Seeing no one else around, Roma smirked triumphantly. So what if it was me? If you can't keep track of your things, you've got no one to blame but yourself. I felt my entire body shaking with rage, but Roma just looked smug. Fiona, you took my man. Don't blame me for taking your position. If you don't leave, how am I supposed to secure a permanent teaching position here? So this was her real motive. Just as I was about to argue with her further, the principal called her into his office. Furious, I went straight to the higher-ups to request a reinvestigation, but the staff there told me, there's already evidence proving your essay was indeed plagiarized. You should go back and wait for the final decision. The result was as expected. I was expelled from the school. The principal told me that if it weren't for my previously excellent performance, they would have held a public criticism meeting to denounce me. How laughable. The original writer was kicked out of the school, while the true plagiarist gleefully secured a permanent teaching position. At the celebration party Luis threw for Roma, I showed up uninvited. I poured a glass of wine all over Roma's head. Luis grabbed me and dragged me out of the restaurant. Fiona, what's wrong with you? It's just a teaching position. Roma is a single mother trying to make ends meet. What's so wrong with letting her have it? If you still want to marry me, stop making trouble for her. So Luis knew all along that I was the one who had been plagiarized. Perhaps he had even been the one to help Roma fabricate the evidence. I slapped him hard across the face. Luis, you disgust me. Rest assured, I will never marry you in this lifetime. But Luis only dismissed my words as an emotional outburst. In his mind, someone who had chased after him her entire life couldn't possibly let go so easily. I thought he would never apologize or admit he was wrong. But 3 days later, for the first time, Luis softened before me. Chapter 4. Fiona. Roma only did it because she was desperate to stay at the school. She acted impulsively when she took your essay. I'm here to apologize on her behalf. After being expelled from school, I had no choice but to return to the old apartment where I used to live. Under the bustling old tenement building, Luis appeared somewhat uneasy. Roma is now being reported for using connections to get her teaching position. I admit I pulled some strings, but she does have real talent to back it up. Doesn't she? Talent? Was it her talent for secretly accepting bribes from parents, or her talent for turning a blind eye to the antics of wealthy students? I let out a cold laugh, remaining silent as I stared at Luis. If you step forward and testify that Roma's essay was indeed original and that you plagiarized hers, she'll be able to keep her position. This was the first time Luis had ever apologized to me, but it wasn't for me, it was for another woman. I couldn't believe he had the audacity to say such shameless words. Get out! I turned my face away, unwilling to waste even a single word on him. The day after tomorrow was my wedding to Leo, and I still had a lot to prepare. I didn't have the time or energy to deal with someone like Luis, but my response seemed to bruise Luis's ego. I bet you were the one who reported her, weren't you, Fiona? So this is the kind of despicable woman you are. Let me tell you this, if you help Roma this one time, I'll agree to marry you. You'd better think it over carefully. So, in Luis's mind, marrying me would be an act of generosity on his part. How laughable. I didn't want it in the slightest. The next day, my closest colleague invited me out for a meal. Foreigners have their bachelor or bachelorette parties, right? Let's have one for you too, she said with a grin. I couldn't refuse, so I went with her to a restaurant. On the way to the restroom, I suddenly heard a familiar voice coming from the private room next door. It was Luis. If it weren't for Roma, I'd never marry that woman. She irritates me just by existing. Through the half-open door, I saw Luis with his arm around Roma, eager to pledge his loyalty to her. Don't worry, you're the only one I'll ever love. Marrying her tomorrow is just to pacify the old man. Otherwise, it'd be harder to pull the strings to keep your job. Roma shyly leaned into his embrace. The more their friends teased, the redder her face became. Perhaps it was the few glasses of wine I'd had, but I suddenly felt a wave of bitterness and pain. I thought I'd long since stopped caring. But hearing Luis belittle me so casually in front of another woman still made my heart ache. So this was what Luis was like in his 20s. Foolish, arrogant, laughable. After decades of being with him, I had almost forgotten what kind of person he was in his youth. A bitter smile tugged at the corners of my lips. Luis, you won't be needed at tomorrow's wedding. Chapter 5. The next day. My wedding with Leo proceeded as planned. The guests were initially stunned. Everyone had assumed I would be marrying Luis, but the groom had already been swapped. Still, because of the family's status, no one dared to say much. They simply offered polite smiles and words of congratulations. As Leo and I made our rounds to toast each table, Luis arrived late, trailing behind Roma in a striking red dress. It was exactly the same as in my previous life. Back then, Luis, wanting to prove that marrying me was purely out of obligation, had deliberately disappeared on the day of our wedding. The groom was absent from the ceremony, making me the subject of ridicule. If it hadn't been for grandfather stepping in to maintain order, I might have broken down completely. Not only that, but Luis had ensured Roma wore a dress similar to mine, drawing everyone's attention to her. Standing on the stage, his gaze never left her, not even for a second. Everyone with eyes could see what was going on. For the sake of appearances, the past version of me had swallowed that humiliation whole. But this time, everything was different. Luis stared at Leo beside me, his face frozen in shock. "Uncle, why are you wearing the groom's suit?" Leo, noticing his outburst, raised an eyebrow slightly. "Of course I'd wear the groom's suit for my own wedding. But look at you, reeking of alcohol and dressed so sloppily. What kind of behavior is this?" Luis's eyes widened, his expression stiff. "What do you mean? Isn't this my wedding?" Grandfather let out a cold laugh, striking his cane against the floor with a sharp thud. "Didn't you say you didn't want to get married? Well, now you've gotten your wish. What's there to be unhappy about?" Luis, visibly shaken, turned to me with an accusatory tone. "Fiona, did you say something to Grandpa and Uncle? Or did you pull some kind of trick? I knew you were up to no good." I didn't want Luis ruining my wedding and was about to respond when Leo stepped forward, placing himself between us. His tone carried an unmistakable authority. "Is the name Fiona something you think you have the right to say? By seniority, you should address her as Aunt Fiona." Luis staggered back in disbelief, nearly causing Roma behind him to fall. "Luis, this is wonderful," Roma exclaimed, her face full of hope. "If your grandfather isn't forcing you to marry Fiona, then we can finally get married." Her eagerness to marry Luis was written all over her face. But before she could finish, grandfather let out a sharp snort. "Not just any woman can marry into this family. Luis, let me tell you this, if you want to bring a woman like her into our house, it'll be over my dead body." Roma's tears fell instantly. She bit her lip, trembling as if she couldn't bear such humiliation. Luis, however, was still reeling, caught between shock and hesitation. "Luis, you promised me you'd marry me. How can you let your family humiliate me like this?" For a moment, Luis looked genuinely torn. The murmurs among the guests grew louder as they pointed and whispered about Roma. "I heard she ran off with some man a few years ago and came back pregnant. Her parents were so angry they passed away. And now she wants to marry Luis? Does she even know her place?" Roma's face turned an embarrassing shade of red and green. She stomped her foot in frustration, turned around, and ran out, covering her face. Luis finally seemed to snap out of his daze. He turned to grandfather and demanded, "Why didn't anyone tell me about the groom's change?" The grandfather replied coldly, "I called your school numerous times, but you refused to answer, thinking it was about forcing you to come back for the wedding. I even sent letters, but you returned every single one of them, didn't you?" Luis's face turned ashen, his shock written all over it. Chapter 6. Luis stood there, at a loss for what to do, before finally deciding to chase after Roma. Thankfully, that annoying little episode didn't disrupt the overall flow of the wedding. That evening, as I sat on the wedding bed, my face was redder than the bright red sheets. I finally voiced the question that had been bothering me. "Was it you who reported Roma to the higher-ups?" Other than Leo, I couldn't think of anyone else who would stand up for me. No one else had the power and ruthless precision to get Roma expelled from the school. Leo nodded quietly, his expression as calm as ever. Now that you're married to me, I won't let you suffer any more grievances. I've also spoken with the school. If you want, you can return to teaching at any time. But this time, I hesitated. It wasn't because of the possibility of running into Luis again at school. It was because, in my previous life, I hadn't realized until after retirement that teaching wasn't something I truly loved. I'd like to try applying for a position at the newspaper, I admitted, my voice cautious. I worried Leo might react like many men, preferring their wives to stay out of public life after marriage. But Leo didn't object. All right, if it's what you want, go for it. And if it doesn't work out, you'll still have me. As I slid my prepared manuscript into the mailbox, I felt both nervous and hopeful. If my article was accepted, it would give me an advantage during the interview at the newspaper. On my way past the department store, I remembered that Leo only seemed to wear plain white shirts. I decided to pick out some nice fabric for him. But to my dismay, I ran into Luis and Roma. Roma was clinging to Luis's arm, pointing at the fabric I had just selected. That one. Wrap it up for me, she said to the salesperson. Suddenly, the fabric I had thought so lovely seemed dull and unappealing. I put the fabric coupon back into my pocket and smiled at the salesperson. Give it to her. Some people just love taking what others no longer want. Roma's reaction was instantaneous, like a cat whose tail had been stepped on. Don't act so bitter just because you can't have it. You weren't so dignified when you were chasing after Luis. I glanced at Luis, looked him up and down, and scoffed. Him? Luis, who had been silent until now, frowned darkly. Fiona, don't think you're anything special just because you married my uncle. All you did was cling to that marriage contract to force your way into our family. Roma isn't like you. She loves me for who I am and doesn't care about my family's status. I noticed a flicker of embarrassment on Roma's face, but she quickly composed herself and leaned against Luis's shoulder as if he were her entire world. Speaking of which, we should thank you, she said sweetly. If not for you, Luis and I wouldn't be together. Soon we'll be one family. When the baby is born, don't forget to come to the celebration. Roma caressed her stomach with a faux maternal smile, clearly trying to provoke me. It wasn't hard to guess her intentions. She planned to use the baby to secure her place in Luis's family. I couldn't help but think how some people never change. Pregnant out of wedlock, and she still acted like it was some kind of honor. It's only because times have changed. A few years ago, the two of you would have ended up in jail for this. With that, I walked past them without a backward glance. As expected, it didn't take Luis long to approach grandfather with his decision. He wanted to marry Roma. Chapter 7. I said, as long as I'm alive, don't even think about letting her step foot into this family. The grandfather was so furious at Luis that he was struggling to catch his breath. But Luis, stubborn as ever, still argued. Grandpa, nowadays people advocate for free love. Besides, Roma is carrying my child. It's my bloodline. What Luis didn't expect was that this statement only made grandfather angrier. A child out of wedlock? You mean a bastard? How did this family end up raising such a shameless disgrace like you? The old man's rage grew, and he even picked up his cane and struck Luis hard on the leg. If you're so determined to marry her, then leave this house immediately and never come back. Luis was expelled from the family. He and Roma held a makeshift wedding in what had once been my marital home, but the only attendees were his group of fair-weather friends. If Luis had any intelligence, he would have realized that the respect others showed him before was only due to his family's reputation. But now that he had publicly announced his separation from the family, who would truly respect him? Even Roma began to berate him daily, complaining about his inability to provide. His teacher's salary wasn't even enough to buy 2 meters of fabric. It wasn't long before Luis came crawling back, seeking forgiveness from grandfather. But grandfather was a man of his word. He left a message with the guard. You can bring the child back, but the extra person is not welcome in this house. And with that, Luis was left standing outside the gates, unable to take a single step inside. At the same time, I had just received a notification from the newspaper. I could start my new job next month. Life, it seemed, was finally improving. Without Luis in my life, The world looked brighter. One day, as I was heading home after work, I overheard some colleagues gossiping. "Did you hear? Luis got cheated on." "Yeah, I know. The lover is the principal from the neighboring school. They were caught in bed by his wife." Apparently, Roma and the principal had been caught red-handed, with no time to even get dressed. In those days, when entertainment was scarce, a scandal like this spread like wildfire, especially since the principal's wife was a fiery character. After catching them in the act, she sat on the floor, wailing loudly for the entire neighborhood to hear. Roma's reason for seducing the principal was simple: she wanted to return to the school. Considering Luis's salary, it was nowhere near enough to support the extravagant lifestyle of Roma and her daughter, let alone another child on the way. This was no small matter. The principal's wife, enraged, called her family for backup and dragged the two of them to the police station. The principal, caught in the scandal of inappropriate relationships, was dismissed from his position at the school. As for Roma, given that she was a pregnant woman without stable employment, the authorities let her off after a few warnings. However, the principal's wife wasn't about to let things slide. She started throwing feces at Luis's doorstep daily and used every disgusting trick in the book to harass them. Luis, already ashamed of being associated with Roma, couldn't bear it anymore. "Grandfather, I was wrong," Luis said, kneeling before the old man, bowing his head in rare humility. Chapter 8. Although grandfather was still angry, he couldn't bring himself to truly exile Luis. In the end, he let him return home. This led to occasional awkward encounters between Luis and me. "Fiona, I was wrong about everything before. I didn't realize Roma was that kind of woman." In my memory, Luis had always been full of confidence and pride. Even as he grew older, he always stood tall, exuding arrogance. But now, he looked as though he'd aged 10 years overnight, burdened by the weight of rumors and ridicule that forced him to lower his head. "It's all in the past," I said lightly, my tone devoid of any emotion. "In the past, I hated him, but now, I was married to Leo, working a job I loved, and watching Luis face the consequences of his actions. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate only exists when you still care. I no longer cared about Luis. So what was left to hate?" "Fiona," Luis hesitated, then finally said what was on his mind. "I know you and my uncle don't have any real feelings for each other. What happened before was my fault. We're the real childhood sweethearts. If you're willing to divorce my uncle, I could still." "I'm not willing." Before he could finish, I interrupted him. What did he take me for? A toy to be summoned and dismissed at will? Someone he only remembered when he was abandoned and down on his luck? How ridiculous! "Luis, I'm doing very well now," I said, looking him directly in the eye, my expression serious. "Who says I don't have feelings for Leo? In my heart, he's 1,000, no, 10,000 times better than you. And remember your place. Next time we meet, you should address me as Aunt Fiona." With that, I turned and walked away without sparing him another glance. It seemed like it was time to suggest to Leo that we move out. After all, sharing a roof with my ex-fiancé wasn't exactly the kind of situation that sounded good to anyone. If word got out, it would only invite ridicule. As I turned the corner, I was suddenly pulled into an embrace. It was Leo. "We're moving out," he said firmly. I wasn't sure how long he'd been listening, but now he was holding me tightly, his tone resolute. I looked up at him and teased, "Are you jealous?" Leo didn't respond, but I noticed the tips of his ears turning red. Our decision to move out went smoothly. Grandfather was an understanding man. When he heard Leo's decision, he didn't say a single word against it. However, on the day we were officially moving out, an unexpected visitor showed up at the door. "Luis, get out here." It was Roma, her belly now noticeably rounded. She was still wearing the same floral dress as before, but her now bulky figure made the previously form-fitting dress look awkward and ill-fitted. "You knocked me up and left me out there alone. You shameless bastard. I'm going to report you for assault. You'd better come out right now, or I'll barge in. Let's see who dares stop a pregnant woman like me." The guards at the gate looked visibly uncomfortable, but they still stood their ground, refusing to let Roma inside. Finally, Just as Roma was about to launch into another tirade, Luis emerged. "And after all the cheating you've done, you still have the nerve to show up at my house?" he snapped. Chapter 9. Luis's face turned bright red with anger at Roma. If it weren't for the people holding him back, he might have done something he would deeply regret. "Cheating? I only did it for us. Do you think I'd be with you if it weren't for your family's money and power? And now look at you, kicked out of your family like trash. If I can't go back to teaching, how are we supposed to survive on your measly salary? What? Should we just starve to death?" Luis, perhaps for the first time, saw Roma's true colors. Her words left him speechless. I watched the scene unfold for a moment, but quickly lost interest in this dog-eat-dog drama. I turned to resume my work on the move, only for Roma to suddenly rush over and block my way. "Fiona, this is your doing, isn't it? You're the reason the old man won't let me into the house." She grabbed my arm and pulled hard, caught off guard. I couldn't break free. I looked around for Leo but couldn't see him anywhere, and a wave of unease crept over me. "Have you lost your mind? Let go of me." But Roma acted as if she hadn't heard a word, continuing her tirade. "It makes you happy, doesn't it? Seeing me like this? So what if you married Leo? You think that makes you special? Let's face it, you're no different from me. We're both just women who spread our legs to climb up in the world. If I can't have it good, then neither will you." With a vicious shove, Roma pushed me to the ground, whether intentional or not. My head struck a rock as I fell. Everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, the first thing I saw was Leo's guilt-ridden face. He looked like he hadn't rested in days, his usually smooth jaw now shadowed with stubble. "Fiona, you're awake. I'm sorry, I didn't protect you like I should have. I promise, I'll never let this happen again. Are you feeling uncomfortable anywhere? Does your head still hurt?" It was the first time I'd heard Leo speak so many words at once. I looked at him with amusement, shaking my head. I tried to sit up, but Leo jumped up from his chair as if he'd been electrified. He scrambled to adjust my pillow, fetch water, and tuck me in. Watching him so flustered, I couldn't help but tease. "It's just a fall, nothing serious. At worst, I'll have a scar on my head." But to my surprise, Leo's face instantly turned red. He hesitated for a long time before finally speaking. "You're about to become a mom, so you should be more careful." The sudden joy overwhelmed me. I couldn't believe it and kept asking him for confirmation. "Really? Are we really having a child?" As Leo nodded repeatedly, I finally realized that there truly was a tiny life growing silently inside me. This was the first time in my 2 lifetimes that I would become a mother. I was so happy that it all felt a little unreal, until someone knocked on the door inappropriately, breaking the moment. "Uncle, I want to talk to her." Leo looked at me, his eyes silently asking for my opinion. I gave him a reassuring look, and only then did Leo step out of the room. But I noticed the edge of a coat he didn't have time to hide outside the door. "Fiona, I'm sorry. I didn't expect her to do something like that to you." I looked at Luis quietly, saying nothing. "I know I've done a lot of things in the past that hurt you. These past few days, I've been thinking about everything we went through and realized how good you were to me. But now, it's too late." The things I needed to say to Luis, I had already said the last time. He should know by now that I'm someone who doesn't change her mind once a decision is made, especially now that I have Leo's child. Chapter 10. So this time, it wasn't just an apology. Seeing that I stayed silent, Luis finally revealed the real reason for his visit. "I know you won't forgive me now, but I beg you, can you let Roma go? Grandfather is furious right now, and Roma won't have an easy time in the future. But she's carrying my child. That's still my child." Luis's face showed a pained expression. He looked at me intently, his face pleading. "Please, Fiona, if you can help me talk to grandfather, I promise I'll make it up to you tenfold in the future." Looking at him like this, I suddenly found Luis quite pitiful. Not only was he cheated on, but he was also played for a fool. But I didn't have enough kindness to protect his so-called innocence. I smiled slightly, seeing my softened demeanor. Hope instantly ignited on Luis's face. However, my next words were, "Since you're my nephew, As your elder, I'd advise you to get a paternity test, thinking about how medical technology isn't that advanced yet. I added, if that's not an option, maybe you should just get your own health checked. In my previous life, even though Luis didn't love me, as a married couple, there were still some natural intimacies that couldn't be avoided. We never had a child in our entire life, and that was because Luis couldn't. So when I heard about Roma's pregnancy, I immediately knew Luis had been cheated on, and thoroughly so. Back then, I didn't say anything because I thought I'd have nothing to do with them in the future. It was better to avoid unnecessary trouble. But now, since Roma has provoked me, she shouldn't blame me for retaliating. After hearing my words, Luis's eyes widened in disbelief. He kept questioning me, asking why I said that. At first, he thought I was lying, but he kept pressing me. Yet, I refused to say another word. Luis gradually lost confidence, shaking his head like a madman as he ran out. The next time I heard Luis's name was in the newspaper. Luis killed Roma. In the marital home where I used to live, he lit a basin of charcoal. By the time they were found, both were already dead. Luis originally wouldn't have been so extreme, but when he confronted Roma, she shouted his impotence for all to hear. The neighbors quickly picked up on it. Before long, the story spread throughout most of the city. Grandfather had to bury his grandson, a white-haired elder mourning a black-haired youth. Leo and I originally wanted to bring him to live with us to take care of him, but he firmly refused, just asking us to come back and visit whenever we have time. That's enough. And then, the little granddaughter tilted her head, her pigtails dangling adorably on either side of her ears. And then, before I could finish, a voice came from the kitchen. Stop telling stories and come eat. I made your favorite fish today. And then, I said with a smile, gently touching my granddaughter's cheek, and then your grandpa would call us to dinner. Step by step, I held her hand and walked into the living room. There, I saw Leo holding a plate of squirrel-shaped mandarin fish, smiling at me gently.